Let me tell you something. The last time I covered what was happening around Crimea, I thought I had pretty good timing. Turns out, I was just a few hours too early. Almost immediately after that video went live, events on the ground accelerated beyond what even I had anticipated. Ukraine launched fresh strikes on the Kerch Strait Bridge, the critical link connecting Crimea to the Russian mainland, and that bridge has now seen multiple shutdowns in the span of a single week. But here's the thing, the bridge isn't even the biggest story here. Simultaneously, Ukraine has been running a methodical campaign to neutralize the only highway feeding into Crimea from the north. And based on everything we're seeing right now, the footage, the reports, the battlefield data, that mission appears to be complete. For all practical purposes, Crimea is now isolated, fully cut off, and it happened in under a week from the moment I said it was coming. What made this especially interesting was the reaction I got after that last video. Russians, and I mean the organized, deliberate kind, showed up in force in my comments. Now, I cover Russia constantly. I talk about the Kremlin, the war, Putin's decisions, all of it. And I almost never get that kind of coordinated pushback. But Crimea, that hit differently. That clearly struck a nerve. And honestly, knowing that they're watching and that this topic makes them uncomfortable, that just makes me want to dig in even deeper. So let's do exactly that. Here's a quick refresher for anyone who needs it, and I'm going to repeat this intentionally, because Russia clearly doesn't want it circulating. Crimea is a peninsula. It sticks out from the southern edge of Ukraine, and it only connects to the surrounding landmass through 3 routes. 2 run through the north, cutting across Russian-occupied Ukrainian territory. The third is the Kerch Strait Bridge to the east. That's it. 3 arteries. If Ukraine severs all 3, nothing gets in, no oil, no ammunition, no food, no reinforcements, nothing. And once that supply chain goes dark, it's only a matter of time before the peninsula becomes militarily indefensible, sitting there like a ripe piece of fruit waiting to be reclaimed. Ukraine has clearly understood this math for a while now, and they've been working the problem from multiple angles over recent months. They systematically dismantled Russian air defense infrastructure across the peninsula, strike after strike, grinding down the protective umbrella that covered Crimea's most critical assets. Then they went after fuel storage facilities, because if the supply lines ever did get cut, they wanted the peninsula to hit an energy crisis fast. They also targeted the ferries Russia had been quietly relying on as a workaround after the Kerch Bridge became too risky for military hardware. Ukraine knocked out the last of those ferries at the end of April. And now, most recently, they've been hammering the northern road corridor with mid-range drone strikes. And the results have been striking. Footage has emerged showing fuel convoys destroyed, military vehicles taken out, and Ukrainian drones operating in that airspace almost completely unopposed. Not with fighter jets, with drones, but the effect is the same. Crimea is now functionally under siege. So the obvious question is, why now? What is Ukraine actually going for here? And what does this mean for the broader arc of the war? The answers, I think, will surprise you, because this isn't just a military maneuver. This might actually be one of the most psychologically sophisticated moves Ukraine has made since the war began. To really understand what Ukraine is doing, you need to understand what Crimea actually means. Not on a map, but in the minds of ordinary Russian people. Because the strategic calculus here isn't purely about land or logistics. It's about something much harder to quantify: perception. One of the most common questions I got after my last video was this: Paul, why does Ukraine even want Crimea back? If it's so easy to lay siege to, wouldn't the same problem exist in reverse once Ukraine controls it? Wouldn't it just become a liability? And look, in pure military terms, maybe if the war is still going hot. But that framing misses the point entirely, because Crimea isn't just a piece of territory, it's a symbol. And in this war, symbols can matter more than supply lines. Crimea has been part of Russia's national story since 2014. Putin's annexation of the peninsula was celebrated across the country like a national triumph. For many Russians, it wasn't just a geopolitical win. It was emotional. It was personal. Crimea is a place Russians vacation. It's coastal. It's warm. It holds nostalgia. Nobody in Moscow is sitting around romanticizing Donetsk or Luhansk. Those are warscapes, devastated, grim, and distant. But Crimea people actually care about on a personal level. Compare that to the Donbass, where most Russians would feel a pang of disappointment at losing, but wouldn't feel it in their gut. Crimea would feel different. Losing Crimea, or even watching it get squeezed, isolated, and humiliated on the world stage would feel like a gut punch to the Russian national identity in a way that nothing else in this conflict really could. President Zelensky himself made this clear early in the war. He said this conflict started in Crimea and it would end in Crimea. The implication being that the fall, or even the serious destabilization of the peninsula, would signal something close to a terminal moment for Russia's war effort, at least politically. And you can actually see Russia's awareness of this dynamic in how they fought the war around Crimea. Every time Ukraine destroys an air defense system there, Russia replaces it, even knowing the replacement will likely be destroyed too. Why? Because they cannot allow the optics of Crimea looking undefended. Russian civilians live there. Russian citizens are watching. Letting Crimea appear vulnerable would be a propaganda catastrophe that no frontline gain elsewhere could offset. Ukraine has been brilliantly exploiting this psychology for a long time. They've strategically left certain supply pathways open longer than they needed to, essentially using Crimea as a trap, where Russia keeps sinking equipment that could otherwise reinforce frontline positions. Every air defense battery destroyed in Crimea is one that isn't protecting Russian cities. And that's part of why we're now seeing Ukrainian drones reach deep into Russian territory, including the outskirts of Moscow, because Russia has been bleeding its defensive resources into this propaganda-driven black hole. But now, the approach seems to be shifting. Ukraine appears to be moving from slow burn attrition towards something more decisive, a closing move. And the timing is not accidental. Right now, inside Russia, something is changing. The population is tired. Russian military bloggers, people who were among the most hawkish voices at the start of this war, are openly questioning the government's strategy. Russian elites are murmuring things that would have been unthinkable 2 years ago. There's a growing crack in the national narrative, and Putin knows it. He's responded by cracking down on VPNs, throttling Telegram, cutting mobile internet in Moscow during protests. He's essentially building a dam against information because he can feel the pressure building behind it. Ukraine started this new Crimea campaign right after Russia's Victory Day parade, a parade that was supposed to project power and instead projected weakness. The optics couldn't have been worse for the Kremlin, and Ukraine clearly took note. So here's the theory I keep coming back to. Ukraine may not actually need to physically retake Crimea to win the psychological war around it. What if all they need to do is make the siege visible? Make it undeniable? Make it something that bleeds into Russian households through returning refugees, through Telegram channels that even censors can't fully kill, through word of mouth that no government can suppress. Think about what happens if hundreds of thousands of Russians living in Crimea decide to leave. Where do they go? Not through a war zone heading north. They cross the Kerch Bridge, the golden escape route Ukraine has deliberately kept open. They pour back into Russian society. They talk to family. They tell neighbors. And suddenly, the story of Crimea being a glorious chapter of Putin's legacy becomes the story of Crimea being a symbol of his failure. That is a narrative Russia cannot survive politically. Not when the population is already as restless as it currently is. Not when even loyalists are starting to whisper. And maybe, just maybe, that's exactly what Ukraine has been building toward all along. Not a military takeover, a psychological checkmate. A moment where the Russian public reaches a breaking point, not because of battlefield losses in some distant field, but because of something personal. Something they vacationed at, something they were told was a great victory, something they were promised would never be touched. If this works even partially, if it accelerates political instability in Moscow, if it builds pressure on Putin from within his own power structure, then Ukraine may have found a way to shift the entire trajectory of this war without a single additional kilometer of frontline movement. That is what's really at stake in Crimea right now. And that's why Russia is so desperate to make sure you never hear any of this. If this kind of analysis is valuable to you, share it. The fact that Russian propagandists specifically mobilize against this content tells you exactly how much they fear the truth getting out. Like the video, subscribe if you haven't, and if you want to go deeper, consider joining as a channel member. I do exclusive Q&As for supporters, and your questions actually shape future content. Thanks for watching. The truth matters, and right now, it matters more than ever.